In the United States, most industries are monopolistically competitive. Monopolistic competition can be thought of as partially monopoly and partially pure competition. Like a purely competitive industry, the monopolistically competitive industry contains many small firms. But each firm produces a product that's slightly different from those produced by other firms. The monopolistically competitive industry has the following attributes. First, there are many firms. Second, all the firms are small. Third, the firms produce a heterogeneous product. And fourth, there's free entry and exit to and from the industry. Notice that the attributes of the monopolistically competitive industry are identical to those of the purely competitive industry, with the exception of item 3. The monopolistically competitive firms produce heterogeneous products. Recall that the purely competitive firms produced homogeneous products. That is, consumers perceived that the firm's products were identical. Monopolistically competitive firms produce the same basic product, but with some minor variations. The variation, or the perception of the variation, whether or not it actually exists, is the source of the heterogeneity. Consider, for example, the jeans industry. Essentially, jeans are identical, but there are slight variations across manufacturers. Some have distinctive stitching, some come in different cuts than others, some are more resistant to shrinking. Beyond these objective differences, consumers might believe that some jeans, for no reason other than the brand name, are better than others. How the firms in the monopolistically competitive industry behave depends on how the consumers perceive the firm's products. The more similar the consumers perceive the firm's products, the more the firms will be forced to behave like purely competitive firms. The more distinctive the consumers perceive the firm's products, the more the firms will be able to behave like monopolies. Monopolistically competitive firms do have some control over the prices of their products, but not as much as monopolies. Recall that control over price means that the firm can cause the equilibrium price of its product to rise by reducing its output, or to fall by increasing its output. The higher a single firm prices its product relative to its competitors, the more consumers will tend to ignore the variation between the firm's products and its competitors' products. For example, suppose Levi's prices its jeans at $35 each and Hollister prices its jeans at $45 each. Hollister could reduce its output a bit, causing its price to rise a little, let's say to $48. But if Hollister were to restrict its output a lot in an attempt to raise its price a lot, let's say to $75, consumers have a strong incentive to reconsider their preference for Hollister jeans. As they reconsider, consumers may find that Hollister jeans really aren't higher quality. Or they may find that they are higher quality, but that the higher quality is not worth the $40 price difference. So the greater the price difference between Hollister and Levi jeans, the greater is the likelihood that consumers will start to ignore the differences in the products and just buy the cheaper one. In short, Hollister does have control over the price of its product, but only so long as its price does not deviate too significantly from Levi's price. Here's a typical monopolistically competitive firm. The firm's profit-maximizing output quantity is found where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect, at 400 units per day. Following this output up to the demand curve shows the market price of the product at $35 per unit. Following the output up to the average total cost curve shows the firm's average cost of $35 per unit. The firm's efficient output is located at 500 units per day, where the average total cost is minimum. Like the monopoly firm, the monopolistically competitive firm produces at an inefficient output level. However, unlike the monopoly firm, the monopolistically competitive firm earns zero economic profit, at least in the long run. A purely competitive industry can become monopolistically competitive if the firms establish brand names and advertise their product. The brand name advertising creates the perception of heterogeneity among the products, which is the distinction between the purely competitive industry and the monopolistically competitive industry. What is required to make this transition from pure competition to monopolistic competition? Firms must create brand names and logos, conduct market surveys to determine where their advertising would have the greatest impact, and then create and conduct an advertising campaign. All of this requires a substantial investment. Recall that the purely competitive firms make zero economic profit. But if monopolistically competitive firms make zero economic profit in the long run, why would a firm spend all the money and effort to establish and market a brand name? The answer is that the monopolistically competitive firm can make positive economic profit in the short run. One way the firm achieves this positive economic profit is through advertising. When the firm advertises, it attempts to alter consumers' perceptions of its product. This alteration of perception causes the firm's demand curve to shift to the right, like this. Notice that the average total cost and marginal cost curves have not moved, but the advertising has caused the firm's demand and consequently its marginal revenue to shift to the right. The firm will charge $45 per unit for this output, and it will cost the firm $36 per unit to produce. Note that the firm earns an economic profit of $9 per unit. But this situation is only temporary. In the long run, either consumers will realize that there's no real difference between this firm's output and the output of the other firms, or consumers will determine that the difference, while real, does not warrant a higher price. Or other firms will incorporate the difference into their products. So in the long run, consumers' preferences for this firm's product will revert back to their normal state, and the firm will be back to making zero economic profit. In order for the firm to continue to make economic profit, it must continually advertise and devise new reasons for its product to be considered different from those of its competitors. Every time it successfully advertises, the firm's demand and marginal revenue curve shifts to the right. Over time, the curves return to their original locations, and the firm must advertise again. There are some industries that do not make the transition from pure competition to monopolistic competition. Consider the nail industry. We never see advertisements for nails. Probably no one can think of a brand name of nails. Why don't nail companies advertise and become monopolistically competitive? The answer has to do with a comparison of the cost of mounting a series of ad campaigns to the present value of the economic profits the firm expects to earn. For some industries, the amount of economic profit the firms could make from being monopolistically competitive is actually less than the cost of establishing and advertising a brand name. For these firms, it's more profitable to remain purely competitive. This tells us why there are far more monopolistically competitive industries than purely competitive industries in this country. Due to the number of literate people, the number of televisions, the low cost of internet advertising, the cost of brand name advertising per potential customer is relatively low. All right, so what have we learned? We've learned that these monopolistically competitive firms make zero economic profit in the long run, and they produce inefficient levels of output. And we know this term inefficiency, it means that the firms are not using society's resources in the best possible way. But that's only half of the picture. What we have to understand is that while these firms are producing at an inefficient output level, they're doing so because they have the ability to differentiate their product from their competitors, thereby drawing consumers to themselves. And so what happens is you get this dynamic of, here's a firm, for example, Apple, that produces an iPhone, and the iPhone has certain attributes that distinguishes it from the BlackBerry. And these attributes, Apple advertises, and in so doing creates its position in the monopolistically competitive industry. It's producing an inefficient output level, but at the same time it's drawing consumers to itself, saying that, look, my product is different, it's actually better than this one. What happens long term? Long term, other firms will see what this firm has done, and they will enter. And some firm will come along with the Android and say, well, look, here's the Android, and it's different from the iPhone in certain key ways, and it's actually better, and so you should come over here and buy this instead. And so again, we have another firm that's producing at an inefficient output level, and yet what has it done? The inefficiency of its use of resources is the cost that we pay as a society for this constant, vibrant updating, this evolution of the products. It's this inefficiency that goes along with the short-run economic profits that causes entrepreneurs to come in here and constantly be trying to one-up the competitor that was the previous dominant firm. This leads to this sequence of ever better and better products, and that's a reasonable price to pay for a little bit of inefficiency.